gentlemen. Welcome to the first episode of Sinosphere, the podcast of the 16th Council on the geopolitics of China. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, the chairman and founder of the 16th Council, Dr. Brian Reuben. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Ishan, for having me. I'm very excited to be here to talk about some of these very important issues. Of course, as you did mention, my name is Dr. Brian Reuben, and I serve as the executive chairman of the Citizen Council.
Very, very glad to have you, sir. So, we recently co authored an article on the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the situation over there with regards to the militancy from the M23 rebels. And in the article, we mentioned how one of the primary concerns that the DRC faces is its resource curse, primarily the extraction of its resources by foreign countries, and China being one of the most prominent players in that area. So, how do you think this model of resource extractive economics is essentially plaguing African countries such as the DRC, with big players and global superpowers like China using their leverage over them?
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. The DRC is one of the world's most resource-rich nations, clearly, with vast deposits of coltan, cobalt, copper, gold, several of them. Yet it remains sadly one of the poorest nations on it. And the UN classified it as a least developed country. All right, I think it ranks about 180th out of around 93 in Human Development Index. That's very sad to look at a country with such resources being so poor. So that's what we call the resource curse. And the hypothesis is at the heart of DRC's paradox. So the DRC has been very vulnerable to exploitative resource extraction by foreign states and non-state actors, and that has led to corruption, conflict, poverty, beginning with when Belgium colonized the country. And then up to this day, China is now its largest trading partner. And all this effort focuses on the resources available in DRC. Again, it's another sad expression of the fact that partnership with developing or least developed countries by more developed powers, countries, has always been on an equal basis. It has never really been to a very large extent to the benefit of the countries, whether it is Western countries, Europe and America, and the companies from there, or with China in recent times. It's actually been that of an equal partnership where you find that these least developed or developing countries are always being exploited. And through things like violence and conflict, somehow it's even been alleged that some of those are engineered, facilitated, promoted by some people who are interested in the resources in those countries. I mean, while we're talking about DRC and China and all of that, we can easily forget the recent revelation from a US congressman that Boko Haram in Nigeria was being funded by USAID. Now that's crazy. Something that's supposed to be made for good. It's destabilizing a region, right? And that is just one of those cases. So DRC is just one case in the many of such cases, not just in Africa, actually, unfortunately. As long as the countries haven't been able to develop properly, this is what we usually see. So again, sad situation with the DRC, something that even the African Union should step up and make sure that that issue is resolved in a way that it benefits the DRC and people of Africa.
Absolutely. And like you said, this is not a problem unique to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is emblematic of wider patterns that we are seeing in Africa. And I think this is a good opportunity to open the conversation up and essentially bring in Chinese involvement in the continent. That is, I see it happening through three major means. First is zero interest loans, which is essentially aid. As you mentioned, USAID and Western organizations are primary in that area. Then there are concessional loans, which are essentially loans that are offered at lower interest rates than market prices or market rates, and that are intended for large infrastructure projects, usually associated with the Belt and Road Initiative, etc. Now, the third most problematic type of economic engagement is through commercial loans, which is featuring higher interest rates akin to what you would expect from normal commercial banks. Now, while we may essentially make the mistake oftentimes of clubbing all of these together in economic engagement with Africa, I think it does require nuanced analysis, because what's happening with China and its commercial loans is essentially China over leveraging these economies with large amounts of debt, which they eventually cannot afford to repay and become over leveraged to China, which erodes their economic sovereignty and autonomy in the long term, at least.
Yeah, I agree with you. Was a question there.
So what I'm trying to ask is essentially over here as to economic dependence on China is considered to be a short term solution. But how do we essentially make these African leaders and economies realize that in the long term, an over reliance on China is not a solution to the problem that they face currently of underdevelopment, underinvestment, and less infrastructure, etc., but is just translating it into a much deeper economic reliance, which in the long term is not a healthy economic situation to be in?
Hmm. Okay, so I believe the African leaders know that. However, the trouble is that they are faced with some situations that make it practically impossible or made it practically impossible to reject the Chinese loans. Let's look at the facts. Um, the African market is worth about $3.1 trillion, all of African markets. Now, that sounds big, and it's projected to grow up to $5 trillion by 2030. Africa is going to very around millions of billions of people, right? But then the European market is worth over $24 trillion. And as of 2024, now the African financial sector manages about $2.5 trillion in assets. The European sector, financial sector, manages over $110 trillion in assets. Why is that so? The European market is developed. The African market isn't developed. Most of what Africans sell and trade are natural resources that are not refined. In Europe, you find complex products. Innovation has gone into it. Creativity has gone into it. Why is it so in Africa? Lack of infrastructure. African countries are infrastructure deficient. Lack of investments. See, so because of this, and lack of the necessary technology, these are key enablers for trade, and it is lacking in the continent. So Africa therefore requires partnership with more developed economies to be able to transit from the current state to developed markets. Now, over the years, Western institutions, governments, and organizations has been dealing with Africa in terms of aid, in terms of investment, in terms of infrastructure development. However, those projects, as we may call it, really depend on adjusting certain values to agree and align with Western values, such as things like human rights. And in much recent time, the human rights also includes accepting certain cultures that might not be acceptable in African countries, like LGBTQ. And then many times also, they'll be required to have to open up their markets, devalue their currency, and all of that to be able to get those help. Now, African countries were doing not necessarily because they like those things, but because they had no option. Now, China wants to be a superpower, just like America, just like any other country would like to be. If Nigeria has the opportunity, it don't like to be a superpower. If Ghana has the opportunity, it don't like to be a superpower. If Kenya has the opportunity, it don't like to be a superpower. If Pakistan has the opportunity, it don't like to be a superpower. So China has an interest that is not a crime. It wants to be a superpower. Now, Western countries, of course, do want to control or limit China's influence because of issues like values and all of that. But China doesn't think that anything is wrong with their values, right? It is Western countries, and maybe people outside China that think that something is wrong with Chinese values. China doesn't think that anything is wrong with their ambition. It is other countries that think something is wrong with China's ambition, and therefore there must be contained. And this is where the geopolitical fight that we see the case, because we want to contain China. So Africa is in need of support and help. Shouldn't be so. Africa should be able to solve its problems, all right, just like other countries. But this is the reality of ground that many African leaders need or want this support, whether as loans, aid, or whatever it is. The available model from Western nations is the fish carries a lot of, disadvantages. China looks at that and exploits the gaps in that model of support and comes up with projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, saying, look, you need infrastructure. We want to get that. No strings attached. You have corruption in your country, your business, deal with it, not China's business. You are killing your people. We don't like it, but that's your business, deal with it. You don't let LGBTQ people get with it, go to church, their business, take care of it, not our business. Otherwise, we're not going to interfere with your culture. We won't interfere with your approach to life. We just want to do business with you on areas where we have common interests. So now you see that ordinarily, this is very compelling. You see, it is compelling because we're not going to have strings attached to this support that will give you. We just want to do business. So the African countries say, oh, this sounds great. I don't have to open up my markets. No, you don't have to. You don't have to devalue our currency. No, you don't have to. Let's just do business. So China came with something truly compelling. And this projects are financed by China's financial institutions. All right. And of course, we know the reason why some Western countries shy away from doing what China is doing. It is risky, right? So China therefore has to put in a lot of mechanisms to protect their interests. But China doesn't force you to sign, right? You are the one. In fact, it is your situation, perhaps your corruption, maybe, that is forcing you to sign. All right. So the only way to solve a problem is for African leaders, and of course, leaders from anywhere that China wants to do business. It is when they step up and demand greater value, right? And demand more open negotiation. That is the only way, and it's a realization that only the leaders of this nation, of these countries, have to make for themselves. They have to realize that they have to make that decision. All right. But ordinarily, the China brought in a very compelling point, very difficult to reject, especially when you are at a point where you don't have more choices. All right. So the only way to answer your question is for Africans to figure out, not just Africans, countries around the world that are doing business with China, to figure out a much better model for doing business. And it would be best when they are able to frame solutions for themselves, by themselves. It is possible for nations to develop technological capacity, all right, to negotiate fairer terms. It is possible. But until that happens, stopping China is very difficult because they are trading in waters where many other countries will find it very hard to even stake their feet into.
Absolutely. And I like how you mentioned the strings attached and conditionalities associated with Western loans, especially from the IMF and World Bank, which are essentially pushing African countries and other underdeveloped countries around the world towards China because of the offer that they're presented with, which they cannot refuse. However, I think one of the conditionalities, and this is where I would like to bring in the geopolitics of all of it, is China's stance on Taiwan. So while these countries may not have economic conditionalities associated with Chinese finance, there is often conditionalities implicitly or explicitly, oftentimes, that the recipient countries of Chinese finance align with Beijing's narratives on the international stage. And this includes Taiwan, of course, an increasingly complex and geopolitical hotspot in world politics. So the Council on Foreign Relations, I remember, did a very nice study where in Latin America, at least, they were able to associate and correspond the changing stance of Latin American countries on Taiwan with them receiving Chinese finance under the Belt and Road Initiative. Do you see something similar happening in Africa? Because Africa is one of those areas in the world which, in the UN and other international organizations, votes as one bloc. So the unity and the coherence of their narrative is very elaborate. So how does, or do you think, is it possible at least that China can use this finance and credit to essentially attract other countries towards its narrative on Taiwan and other issues that are salient to Beijing?
That's exactly part of what China set out to achieve. See, to become a superpower, you need to get your strategy right. One of the three key motivations that I see in the China era is soft power and political influence. China deepens its political, diplomatic, and economic ties with African elites, often engaging in opaque financial arrangements. And of course, you know about the case with Angola, where billions in oil-backed Chinese loans were unaccounted for. And that's just an example. So when countries find themselves in a situation where they are able to repay the Chinese loans, as being the case in Kenya having difficulties and other countries as well. When that happens, of course, that strengthens China's soft power and will naturally make it difficult for these countries to vote against China in international issues, like you mentioned. So, absolutely, that's what you see. China uses this to gain leverage. It is unfortunate, but that is a fact. When we look at this from the ethical perspective, we could feel China is doing something right, but China is not looking at it. And ethics is dependent on who is looking at it really. So China is looking at it from a business and geopolitical perspective. What do we need? We want Taiwan, for example. You see, there are other influences where we would like to exert our influence, and we need support. How do we get that? If Kenya is owing China, and China decides to review the conditions of that loan and renegotiate it, part of the condition could be what you just stated. So as this happens, the influence, the soft power of China increases. The political influence of China increases, and it becomes almost impossible to oppose China. You don't even have the ability to do that because you owe them lots of money that you cannot owe. Money you owe them money that could even threaten your sovereignty. If it's looked at critically. So and you have an opportunity to keep this going in a way that is convenient for you. China understands. But what are you going to give China in exchange? China wants Taiwan. You don't need Taiwan. China is supporting you. America isn't supporting you. You are owing China a lot of money. You are in America. So what are you going to do under this circumstance? Right? So you scratch our back while we scratch yours. Simple.
So how do you see, what do you think the way forward for Africa and China relations will be? essentially in resource rich countries such as the DRC, because as competition between Beijing and Washington intensifies, there will be a greater rush towards these resource rich countries and the incentives that they can provide. So, what are your predictions?
Okay, I believe your question is the way forward. Am I correct? Okay, let's so for diversify your financing sources. African countries need to avoid over reliance on China and Chinese credit by engaging with multiple global partners. And this is not very hard to do, really. It's about settling down, understanding the value you have, and creating a compelling proposition yourself that does not necessarily mean giving yourselves away. All right. The other is to actually negotiate better terms. See, these are negotiations. China doesn't put a gun by your head and say you must sign. No. So African countries can actually negotiate better terms. African leaders must say, sure, their infrastructure projects benefit their economies, not just China's strategic interest. Because with the BRI, it goes beyond China giving you the funds, very quickly. Chinese have to have boots on ground. They bring their people to take care of the construction, limiting the opportunity to get the local people employed and engaged in those activities. So that's ethically speaking, that doesn't look so fair. But in business and geostrategy terms, it makes a lot of sense for China because China has a lot of people who need to work and then this is a way of exporting labor. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's working for Kenya or for DRC. It could have been better. So negotiate better trade terms. Thirdly, strengthen governance, greater transparency in loan agreement is critical to ensuring these projects serve public interest. So you've got to make sure that there is greater transparency, governance. And finally, I would say invest in local capacity. Future deals should prioritize skills transfer and local employment. Not it shouldn't be the other way around. So these are four key things I think African leaders should do going forward.
Absolutely. And I think the conclusions that we can draw from this whole episodes and your insights, of course, is that democracy is a slow process. Things take time, they're often bureaucratic. But authoritarian countries like China may offer an alternative and use the market gap to step in. But this does not, I think, always mean that they won't have challenges associated with their own finance. And as you said, ultimately, Africa needs to focus on building its strategic autonomy and encouraging endogenous development powered by its own people rather than relying on external finance, which will always have interests associated with it, regardless if you do it with China, if you do it with the US, or any other foreign country for that matter.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Sean. That's my perspective on that. Whether it is China or America or England, wherever it is, you've got to step up in your negotiations, step up in governance, and make sure that they serve your interests. Africa is a great continent filled with opportunities. But the leaders have to step up. The leaders, mostly in political position, should have to step up and put the interests of Africa first. I like from say America first. The leader plus in Africa should say Africa first. And when you do that, we can begin to reverse all of what's happened in the past that has put Africa in a place where China's interest and influence is growing day by day in Africa, including military presence. And even the ports we talk about, even though some of those ports serve dual purposes. They can serve military interests. They can serve interest for Chinese to refuel their vessels and do repairs, and because they all hold those opportunities. And so this is a country that had a strategy, and they began to implement that strategy. And the world is shouting. It is time for African leaders to have a strategy that they believe in, a strategy that every country buys into, commits to, a strategy that can help make Africa better and deliver a much more prosperous continent.
Indeed. And of course, this arena requires a lot of policy focus, which is where organizations like the 16th Council step in, where we aim to provide cutting edge research on these themes with China and, of course, other policy areas. So I would request the audience to stay tuned for further episodes, keep following us and our research as well. Dr. Reuben, thank you very much for your time. It was amazing to talk to you like always, and your insights were absolutely cutting edge.
Thank you, Ishan. It's been an honor talking with you.